welcome to Saturday Night at the Movies, the podcast that celebrates classic cult and current films and the people that made them, and many other aspects of pop culture. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer is Ben Shrewsbury, and our signature theme was composed by Greg Lerhoff. Here it's always Saturday night, and our mission is to chronicle film and pop cultural history one memory at a time. Tonight, I promise you one of our most compelling shows ever. Our guest is Marcia Clark, a practicing criminal attorney since 1979, known internationally as the lead prosecutor on the OJ Simpson case, the best-selling author of 9 legal thrillers, and the author of a fascinating new book on one of the most celebrated murder cases of the 1950s, the Barbara Graham case, which was notably dramatized in the 1958 film I Want to Live, which netted actress Susan Hayward the Best Actress Oscar that year. Marcia's book is a terrific true legal thriller that dramatically exposes the holes in the original prosecution case that sent Mrs. Graham to the gas chamber. Not surprisingly, the book is called Trial by Ambush. Welcome, Marcia.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you here. I love the book. As I told you, I just finished it on the airplane yesterday. We'll get into that. This is a classic film podcast, but we cover so many aspects of pop culture and related things. I always ask my guests when they were little, what was the movie theater they always went to with their family? Do you remember?
Oh my God. I think, oh, what a great question. I'm going to get the name wrong, but I can picture it in my mind. I'm so bad with names, but I think it was the Edgemont Theater. Um,
And where was this
and
located?
and it was like, maybe a mile from the house and it really wasn't so much I went with my parents as I went with my friends for the cartoons, the kid movies and stuff. That
Sure.
would be a place they could park us and get an afternoon off.
Was that an LA theater?
Oh yeah, down in it was actually down in Covina, Southern
Covina.
California.
Do you remember a movie that really had an impact on you as when you were little? Was there any specific movie? I know we all, as kids, went to see all the Disney movies. It was kind of a thing. Uh,
Yep.
but anything ring a bell, etc.?
Trying to remember, was there one in particular? I feel like I watched so many, and because it's like it was almost like a Saturday afternoon ritual, to be there. And so I'm awash in possibilities if I could only remember their names. Certainly all the Disney movies for sure. I don't think any one of them stands out until I reach the age of, I want to say 9, maybe, when I saw an Elvis Presley film. And it was Elvis Presley with Anne Margaret. And I was like, oh, that was like amazing to me.
Viva Las Vegas.
Yeah, was it that? That might be it.
That
And it
was
was
that was Presley and Margaret. I think that impressed all of us. That was I think 64, if I'm not mistaken. Uh, sure, sure. Well, this whole show kind of originated serendipitously. I tape a lot of or record a lot of movies on my DVR to watch when I do my morning exercise ritual. And I noticed that TCM was running I Want to Live, and I hadn't seen it since I was a little kid. Literally, I probably saw it in 1958 when I was 6. I think I probably went with my parents. It was definitely not a Saturday morning kiddie matinee. And I hadn't seen it in so many years, and I've been a Susan Hayward fan. Here's a little bit of trivia you don't know. Susan Hayward was the first person considered to play James Bond. They
You're
were
kidding.
they were gonna do it as a female Bond back in the 1950s. She was under contract, I believe, at Fox at that time. And Gregory Ratoff, who was an actor producer, got the rights to Casino Royale, the first Ian Fleming novel. And I was told by a writer who worked for Gregory that Lorenzo Semple Jr. was the writer who later wrote Batman. He told me they were developing it as a Susan Hayward vehicle. Isn't that crazy?
That's wild. I mean, it's wild to think about it back that far. I mean, back then, that was a long time before women's rights were really a thing. And the notion of a female lead playing a role like that back then, how revolutionary was that?
It was
I
crazy. It
mean,
was absolutely
yeah,
crazy. Well, obviously it didn't take. So, we got Sean Connery instead, which I think was a probably a good replacement. And how?
yeah,
So,
it worked.
this is quite a story, and I know we can't spend the whole day, although we probably could spend the whole day. But I am going to start. This is a story, a murder story, and I want to start. I've got a number of images that I want to pull up, but I think that when you're doing a murder story, one of the first things you talk about is the victim. And I was going to ask you right off the top, can you tell me a little bit what you know about Mabel Monaghan, the woman who was murdered?
Yeah, so this is a story that took me by surprise because all of the characters are so vivid. They're so incredible. Each one of them is a gem in terms of being very specific and very vivid. And so they really lodge in your mind. And Mabel Monaghan was a perfect example of this. She'd been a vaudeville trouper, ice skater, roller skater. That's how she met her husband on the circuit, vaudeville circuit. He was a renowned nationwide ice and roller skater, and they became a dynamic duo performing together. And there was this mock-up of them that was their poster showing him holding on to her by a rope in his mouth and in her mouth as he's spinning around and she's spinning through the air. It was amazing. Yeah. So they got married eventually after touring, and then I think they eventually got divorced when they moved back to California. And she wound up with a daughter named Iris. That daughter, I mean, more characters ensue. That daughter, Iris, who was a performer, auditioned for the floor show at this giant refurbished kind of yacht called Ships, being owned and run by Tudor Scherer, who was trying to break into the gambling business in Los Angeles. And then it was during time of Prohibition. And so he used the bottom level as a speakeasy. And he hired Iris to perform in the floor show and then married her. He then soon realized that Mickey Cohen was not going to take kindly to him trying to edge into the gambling business. So Tudor Scherer decamped for Las Vegas, where he opened his own casino and became a real estate entrepreneur, very wealthy and very, very successful in business as well as with the ladies, which did not sit well with Iris. After 13 rocky years of marriage, they got divorced. In the settlement, he was very generous and he gave her a house he owned in Burbank on Parkland Avenue. And that house, I think, had too many memories for her. She gave it to Mabel. And Mabel, for the first time ever, became a homeowner. Iris moved to New York. But Tudor Scherer remained a tight friend of Mabel, so he would come to visit her. And that is what actually set her up to become the victim.
All of this interesting backstory was not in the film. So one of the things we'll talk about today is how much of a revelation your book was, because I learned things that I didn't know anything about the motivation for the crime. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the crime is not depicted in the movie at all. It's almost like, it's she's arrested, and through a series of conversations, you learn that she's now part of a murder investigation. But I thought that was really interesting. Well, let's get a little bit into Barbara Graham, because obviously she is a very interesting woman, and certainly someone who had a terrible life. I guess she was one of the, we think of it today as commonplace that people are abused. So many people are, but it seemed like back in the 50s, she had a pretty just terrible life.
She really did. And yet, even the picture you have up right now, which is a great one, doesn't do her justice. She was very beautiful. But she was somebody who got thrown away at birth. Her mother really didn't want her for whatever reason. Barbara never knew her father. Her mother would go on to have two other children with fathers unknown. But for some reason, those children did not get the rough treatment Barbara did. Barbara, in particular, was thrown out and thrown among relatives and also strangers uh, from birth, really. And the only good time she had was a brief stint she got to do in a convent where the sisters were very kind to her, and she has very fond memories of that. But other than that, it was a torturous childhood and a very dangerous one. She had, for one brief moment, her mother settled with a man. He was a father figure who was good to her, but he didn't last very long. He passed away after a year. She wound up getting sent to uh, this reform school, the Ventura County School for Girls, which was nothing short of a torturous. It was really their idea of discipline was basically waterboarding and then working the girls to death for 14 hours at a stretch. And they had been written up by Hearst and his publications many times for being their discipline being much more like torture than anything else. And they pushed back on it. But the truth of the matter is, it was a horrifying place. And she kept running away. And her mother had been there herself not so long before Barbara had. When she was pregnant, I think, or shortly before she became pregnant with Barbara, she had been incarcerated there. And she knew how bad they were. Nevertheless, kept calling the cops to send Barbara back in handcuffs every time she ran away. So it was a very rough life. I think she made it to the eighth grade, maybe. And still, her life was her crimes were all misdemeanors. Even so, I mean, with no education and no skills to speak of, really, she was very intelligent, had a natural bent towards culture, was interested in jazz, classical music, um, was read the Rubaiyat by Omar Khayyam. She was an amazing person, but never made it through the eighth grade. And yet her crimes were all misdemeanors, shoplifting, bad checks, that sort of thing. The things that fringe people with no skills will have to do to survive.
And, I guess the fact that one of her husbands was a drug addict, her last husband, and she started to I guess she became what I guess in those days it was like a party girl, and that graduated to some other things and hooking up with the wrong people. And some of these people, just as you point out, is like a rogues gallery of bad people. I'm going to throw up a picture of, well, basically and I learned obviously this from your book because you're so detailed, is that one night four men decide to rob Mabel Monahan's house because they hear that there is going to be some serious money there. And I also found it very interesting when your book basically says that they after they do Mabel in, they ransack the house. And is it true the money and the jewels was sitting in a purse hanging in the closet they completely missed? These guys were really, the bad news bears of criminals.
To put it mildly. So it's really actually the genesis of this crime was 2 years earlier because of the visits that Tudor Scherer would pay to Mabel Monahan because they remained friends. The rumor started to circulate that he was skimming money off the casino business and hiding it with her. And so they built up this whole story that Barbara herself called a fairy tale. That there was a safe with hundreds of thousands of dollars in it because Tudor Scherer kept stashing it with Mabel. Not so. But finally, after a couple of years of trying to case the place and trying to figure out a way in, Mabel was very security conscious and she had lived in hotels all her life. So she was afraid to leave anything open. She was not used to having all that space around her, a house with a garden and a backyard and all that. So she kept everything locked up tight and would never answer the door. They thought, but if Barbara, who was petite, very pretty, and soft spoken, and if she came in and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, but my car broke down. If you could just let me use your phone," then Mabel would open the door, and sure enough, she did. And that was her undoing. Barbara walked in, the men walked in behind her, and they ransacked the place. They tore up the carpets. They were sure they were going to find a safe. And so they tore the whole place upside down, never found one. They even went through Mabel's closet, upended all of the purses, found nothing. And yet, yes, ironically, left the one purse hanging on a hook that she had just used to go play poker the night before, where she liked to keep all of her jewelry and her cash. And there was a ton of cash and all this really expensive jewelry with like platinum and diamonds, you name it. That one they didn't touch. And they walked away with nothing.
They walked away with nothing. It's funny. You mentioned that one of their planning moments is they went down to the old smokehouse restaurant across from Warner Brothers, where I had lunch last week. And I'm reading about the smokehouse with those red leather, booths, etc. And it just brought it all right back to me. So let's take a look at these guys. It's quite a group. Well, we'll start with one of them, who is Baxter Shorter. Now, I believe Baxter Shorter was brought in because he was a safecracker.
Yes. Also, he was the only one who really knew where Mabel Monahan lived. So yeah, he was a box man, as they call it back then, a safecracker. And he was the one who would lead them to Mabel Monahan's house that night. He was just going to be a lookout, and that's really all he really was. And he figured, well, they promised him 10% of the take, and all he had to do was drive to a house and sit outside. Pretty good money, considering he expected that there would be hundreds of thousands of dollars. He would walk away with tens of thousands for just sitting outside. Hell of a deal. The others were going to be the ones to go inside and, and basically score the money and find the safe, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, so let's see. I think this is this John True? I think this might be John True, at
Yes.
least. Yes, and John
Yes.
True was also there. And then the two principals that we've heard a lot, and of course are depicted in the movie, um, are Emmett the Weasel Perkins, and of course his Confederate Jack Santo. And I think I have a picture of them both here. Let's see. Um, I think I have them here. Let's see. No, actually,
Well, I'll say on the left is Emmett Perkins.
that is
On
Emmett
the right,
Perkins.
it
Okay.
looks like could be J. Miller Levy, could be the prosecutor. I'm
That
not
I think
sure.
was the prosecutor. I have another shot of Jack Santo. I'll get it in a minute. But these two guys were really serious, hardened criminals, and I think it's intimated that they had also committed murder before.
Yes. So, okay. So Barbara met Emmett Perkins up north, and she was his dice girl, if you will, a shill. He liked to run gambling houses, and she would induce men to part with their money. And that's also how she wound up meeting her final husband. She married and divorced three times, had a few kids in the interim that were parked with her mother-in-law's various, and then wound up meeting. What she would do is go to these nice hotel bars, meet men. They would want to go then someplace private, and she would say, "But on the way, why don't we stop here?" And that would be the gambling house that was run by Emmett Perkins. One of the bartenders at one of those hotels was Hank Graham. And Hank was the one who basically had a side gig as well. He would hook up the men who hung out at the bar with pretty girls that would come by. There was a perfect side gig for him and a perfect side gig. They met because of their businesses. And then she fell in love. And that was really the love of her life. Hank was the one that she really fell for some reason. At the time she met him, she didn't know that he had a drug habit. I think that maybe he was off the off the drugs at that time, and so they fell in love, um, and that leads to something else we'll get to in a minute. So
So
Emmett
that
Perkins was the one she initially worked with, and then towards the end, it was like just a few months before the actual crime occurs that she meets Jack Santos. He shows up, and he had been up north. What she didn't know, I'm sure, is that Perkins and Santos had been involved in multiple murders up north in the gold country, as well as just in Grass Valley. They were notorious, and particularly Santo was.
well, the story is a very interesting one. Like you say, they leave. Well, there's a whole thing that happens in the course of the robbery. That one of the big controversies is that Mabel is pistol whipped. And according to the testimony early on by Mr. Baxter Shorter, it was not Barbara Gran who pistol whipped Mabel Monahan, but it was most likely one of the others. It could have been John True. I don't think I have a picture of John True, but something strange happened in this investigation. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about J. Miller Levy, who was the prosecuting attorney. It's interesting. I found it very interesting that you, who have obviously been a prosecuting attorney, started poking holes in this prosecuting attorney's case. And that was the most fascinating part of the book for me, because here it was that, this is 1953. I mean, this is ancient history. Things were done a lot differently, and there was a lot more latitude for the prosecuting attorney to do things that today, as you point out, they would never do, thanks to some legislation over the years. I think even you in writing the book talk about how shocking these moments were for you to read, and you became angrier and angrier, I believe.
Really did. I mean, Steve, I couldn't believe it. That a lot of case law came down after this case, after Barbara's trial, that changed things radically. But J. Miller Levy pushed through that and pushed the envelope and then went beyond it as well. And he violated rules of discovery and behavior in the courtroom that actually was not even lawful back then. But he was in front of a hanging judge who was inclined to give him all the latitude he wanted. And so it was a really shocking thing to see a prosecutor go beyond. I mean, he buried a key witness. He hid a key piece of discovery on their star witness. John True became their star witness. They had to turn one of the four perpetrators because Baxter Shorter, who was really kind of the best person in a way to testify because he clearly had not taken part in the murder itself, got disappeared before the trial could get underway. And they suspect, and probably rightfully so, that Santo and Perkins killed him. He was never found. His body was never found. And he was kidnapped at gunpoint, according to his wife, by Emmett Perkins. John True was the one who ultimately did testify. I called him the ironically named John True because he was a big liar. He was such a liar, an obvious one too. And it really struck me just logistically how what he described as happening once he and Barbara entered the house, Mabel's house, made no sense, made no physical sense, and how no one thought to call that out kind of blew my mind just in and of itself. Forget about DNA and all that other jazz. You don't need it. All you have to do is think logically about how does this work? Barbara's so small. Mabel was a bigger woman than she was, even though she walked with a limp. It would be very hard for Barbara to control her and pistol whip her the way John True described in vicious manner. So anyway,
Well, and
he
Barbara had
described Barbara as being, yeah, as being the vicious, most monstrous one, although he admitted that Jack Santo was the one who tied the garrote around Mabel's neck, and that ultimately was the coup de grace that killed her. So there was so much that J. Miller Levy did to bias the jury against her in ways that were incredibly unfair. That it really blew. I had to get up and walk away from the computer so many times. I said, I can't read this anymore.
I mean, it's
Can't
almost like
stand it.
I wish we had a time machine that you could go back in time and be her defense attorney. But I have a feeling, even if you were her defense attorney back in 1953, the odds would have still been stacked against you. As you point out, the judge was awful. The other thing that was interesting, because Barbara had no money, unlike a very famous defendant we know who bought the Dream Team. Barbara could not only not buy the Dream Team, she had to get a court-appointed attorney who was basically doing the case for free and had no budget to hire an investigator. I think you mentioned that several times, that when there are things that could have possibly saved her, she couldn't send anybody out to find the information. This whole thing that they took. Shorter disappears. True becomes their bought witness, and they take Shorter's testimony and put it in True's mouth, but not the testimony about Barbara not doing the pistol whipping. That was extraordinary. So Barbara's accused of, well, since somebody died in this murder robbery, everybody who was there was accused of murder, including Barbara. And it slowly began to dawn on her that if she didn't provide an alibi, she would be going to the gas chamber. I mean, talk about pressure on you. And she literally couldn't. This is one of the interesting parts of the book, because she can't remember March 9th, 1953. She doesn't talk much. In fact, I don't think in your book it ever mentions her talking about being in the house that night, because maybe is it because that if she mentioned that she'd been in the house that night, it would have nailed her as a murderer? Is that part of the reason?
Sure, that's the whole reason. So, Barbara, back then, the felony murder rule say, and in many states still today, the felony murder rule states that if you commit one of these enumerated crimes, violent crimes, or potentially violent crimes, burglary, robbery, kidnapping, etc., and in the course of that crime, a murder occurs, a death occurs, even if it's accidental, you're all on the hook for murder and first degree murder at that. And back then, you were also on the hook for the death penalty. So if you're there, if you're participating in the felony and the murder happens, no matter how it happens and no matter who did it, you're guilty of it too, equally guilty. So back then, the only defense that you could have would be that you're not there, because if you're there, you're toast. So she had to come up with an alibi, but she kept telling her lawyer, I don't have one. I don't know where I was. I don't know where I was. Look, I conclude, in all fairness, she knew where she was. She was there, but she couldn't say that. And the lawyer kept saying, look, if you have an alibi, then you need to say something to me. You can't just say, I don't remember. Nobody's going to buy that. And then her rejoinder to him was, do you know where you were that night? All right, that's very smart. But you do know where you
If
were.
if she if
Anyway,
she Marcia, if
but
she had confessed to have been there, but she adamantly, I mean, I don't know if it's obvious, but she obviously saw who pistol whipped, but there were no other witnesses. I guess that wouldn't have done her any good.
no. I mean, at the end of the day, how about self-interest? Why would she admit to pistol whipping Mabel? Once she admits to being there, the jury can disregard the rest. Say, well, of course she said she didn't pistol whip her. I mean, why wouldn't she lie about that? It would just be her word against John True's. Now, maybe she could have sold it. Who knows? But there was no incentive for her to make the admission. There was no incentive for her to say, I was there, but I didn't do this, because the likelihood of her being able to sell it was was very slim. I want to go back to the thing you mentioned that's so important. Back in the day when her trial was going on, when a defendant could not afford to hire a lawyer, there was no public defender. There was no such thing. What the judge would do is simply select someone from the private bar and say, you will represent this person and you will do it for free. That meant, especially in a case like this that goes on for months, that the lawyer's whole practice tanked while they're representing this person for nothing. What's even worse is that the lawyer has to be able to go out of pocket to hire an investigator. The most important aspect of a defense is your ability to investigate from the defense point of view. If you can't afford to go hire an investigator because you have, not only are you not getting paid, but you have to dig into your own pocket and you're not able to take other cases to cover the expense, you're really hamstrung. And it was something that Jack Hardy, her lawyer, who was really did an excellent job. I was very impressed with him. I thought, but he lamented to the jury, it's just not fair. We can't go out and find all these witnesses that she could have otherwise found and done her some good. And they fell into actually, excuse me, they got lucky and fell into an excellent alibi witness anyway, but by then it was too late. So, the defense was kind of hamstrung coming and going. And then you have the prosecution playing games with a key defense witness, a key witness who would have been for the defense, named Donna Prow, who was somebody who suckered Barbara into getting a false alibi.
No,
And
I was going to mention that, but before I
yeah.
mention that, um, what's the incentive for an attorney? I guess not volunteering, but being recruited to be the attorney. What was it that I mean? What would have been his incentive? Is it because it's a high profile case? I mean, what's the deal?
Actually, a high profile case would be even more reason not to take it in many ways, because it just subjects you to enormous pressure and exposure without any means of really doing the best possible job, though I thought he really did. Um, I think it's to curry favor with the judge. You have to stay in good standing with the judge. And it was also believed back then that it was a part of your duty, a way of giving back to society. You owe it to do them to give free legal services at some point in your career. And that still exists today. I mean, some of the big law firms, as a matter of course, provide some pro bono legal services. Of course, they're being extorted into doing it now by Trump. That's a whole other story. But they were always supposed to do some degree of pro bono work.
Now we talk now about Donna Prow. This was really maddening. The fact is that the police decide to put an informant in. I don't even know if an informant is the best way to describe it. They decide to put somebody in the prison who's working. I guess she is an informant. She's working for the police to get close to Barbara, to really become almost, I guess, even romantically involved in a way because they're trading love notes back and forth. And this person is totally bought by the police to make her take a false alibi by saying that I've got a friend who could provide that for you. And so I guess her attorney, Barbara's attorney, had been telling her that if you don't come up with an alibi, you're going to go to the gas chamber. So it's hanging over her like the sword of Damocles. She's desperate. Her back's against the wall. She has nothing. So she accepts this thing. And then, of course, at the trial, the guy who turns out, well, the guy who was supposedly going to give her the false alibi, comes into the courtroom, gets on the witness stand, and identifies himself as an LA policeman. How devastating was that moment?
I mean, the bombshell moment. The prosecution withheld that bombshell moment until the very end of their case. And this is what I mean by these characters are all so vivid and so interesting. Donna Prow, or as the press repeatedly referred to her as the pretty Donna Prow, she was somebody who had been very close with the lieutenant of Burbank Police Department, Lieutenant Robert Coveney. And she had known him since way before this trial because she herself was involved in a drunk driving case that was so awful. She took out a family of five. She had pounded a bunch of pills, a bunch of alcohol, got in a car, and was careening down Riverside Drive, which you know, I'm sure, Steve, major league artery that runs right through all of the studios. And she was, I mean, driving up on the sidewalk, hit a fire hydrant, hit a parked car, and then wound up head-on collision with a family of five, killing one, maiming the rest of them. It was hideous, for which she got 1 year in jail. I mean, back then, we just didn't take that stuff seriously. Anyway, she had already been friendly with Lieutenant Coveney by then, and she called on him as a witness for her probation officer to speak up for her as someone that she could call on now and then. So they were having an affair. That was my conclusion, in my opinion. When this whole case broke with Barbara, she was already in jail for the drunk driving case. And he knew he had an ace in the hole there. And he went to his buddy, Donna Prow, and said, "Hey, look, talk her into going along with a false alibi." And she was reporting to Lieutenant Coveney like almost on a daily basis and she and Barbara were exchanging love notes. Now, you're not allowed to exchange notes in jail. So Barbara was throwing away all of Donna's notes because she would get in trouble if they were found. But Donna was saving all of Barbara's notes. So they wound up, the prosecution did, with all of these love notes and love you, honey, and you're my favorite, and blah, 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 and all this other stuff, which J. Miller Levy used to basically just destroy Barbara's character, because back then gay was not okay,
Mhm.
and particularly not women. Women being gay was like, oh my God. And so he used it to great effect. And that was like yet another way in which they just there was no chance, as you said. You could be the best defense attorney in the world and you're not going to win this case. So the defense, when they found out about Donna Prow, wanted to find her because it looks a lot different. If you can put her on the witness stand and show how she was pressuring Barbara constantly, you've got to do this, you've got to do this. And even from the letters, you could get that sense. As I was reading the letters, I was seeing it was really Barbara who was hitching up and pulling back and saying, this scares me, I don't know. And Donna saying, you've got to do it, you've got to do it. That looks a lot different than just being able to smack her around with love letters and Donna's not there.
Well,
The defense tried to.
especially since the prosecution was portraying the fact that it was Barbara that was seeking the phony
Yes.
alibi. It wasn't being pushed into it. Now you say that the idea of the police getting an informant and like that and doing this whole campaign to get Barbara to take the false alibi would never fly today. They could never do something like that, correct?
Correct. Yes. For sure, whatever Donna was doing, that would have been certainly not allowed. That could have gotten the case dismissed just by itself because Barbara was already represented by counsel, had been indicted, and all of the rights under Messiah, is the name of the case, attach. So that plus the confession that the undercover officer that she hired for the false alibi, he really put the screws to her. And some of it was actually tape recorded. They tried to record. It didn't work that well because of technology back then. But he got her to admit and literally forced her to admit that she was with the men that night, that she was there. And that none of that would have come in. None of that would have been allowed. In fact, I do think ultimately that's so much dirt, the case would have been dismissed altogether.
I often wonder when the judge turns to the jury and says, "You will disregard what you just heard." Does that ever really work? Don't the jurors, when they go into the deliberation room, don't they remember everything, etc.? I mean, isn't it kind of the hope you won't remember that?
Yeah, I've always thought that. I mean, it's just bullshit. You know, I mean, how is a jury supposed to forget that they heard what they heard? They can't. They're human beings, you know. I mean, you hear this stuff, especially almost when a judge says, strike that, you'll forget it. It's almost like the red alarm, alarm, alarm. This is interesting. This is important. And you almost hang a bell on it. You remember it even more. And it's kind of like there's a jury instruction that a judge always gives saying, you will not take anything I have said or done as a cue, as blah, 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 and all that stuff. And I believe that judges absolutely try to not give the jury any sense of how they feel about the case or about the prosecutor or the defense. And yet it inevitably does show up, or not inevitably in every case, but it often does show up in the way they treat both sides. They're not going to treat them equally. And when they don't, the jury does take its cue from what the judge is doing. You can't avoid that. And this judge made it really clear what side he preferred. You couldn't miss that he was a pro-prosecution judge.
Well, there are murders every day. There are robberies every day. I mean, this case it, it was kind of, I won't say it was like the OJ Simpson case of that year, but it certainly was the type of case that fed the press in a frenzy moment. I mean, they picked up on the fact that Barbara was on trial for murder. They nicknamed her Bloody Babs, and it splashed over all these headlines. I remember living in LA back in the 50s. We had the Herald Examiner, and whereas the LA Times was a pretty low-key newspaper, the Herald would blast their headlines and these big, big headlines. And of course, all of this portrayed whether she was a lesbian or whether she was a murderess, that she pistol whipped a woman. I mean, she became this awful figure. And in a way, it kind of pre-sentenced her because of the press attitude.
Totally. It was remarkable. I mean, and remember back then you had a lot of newspapers. Herald Examiner was one, but there were a ton of others. Daily Mirror, LA Mirror. I mean, it was ridiculous. And they were putting out releases in the morning and in the evening. So twice a day, you had these blasting headlines, and it was huge. I mean, it got national coverage, and it permeated the airwaves on radio as well as on in print in Los Angeles and throughout California, really. And so it was interesting. The judge, as he should, warned the jurors, do not pay attention to the press, do not read any reports, do not read any newspapers, but they could hardly avoid it. Back then, you had newspapers that were set up in these glass cases, and the newspapers deliberately put their most catchy headlines where you could see through the glass. So even if you were walking past it, you couldn't miss Bloody Babs, blah, 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 whatever. That's how they got you to drop the coin in the slot to buy the newspaper. And those glass cases lined the sidewalks in front of the courthouse. So the jurors just coming and going were going to see all of this press, whether they wanted to or not. It was inescapable.
So, Barbara goes to trial. Obviously, it's a disaster. She gets sentenced to death. She's sent up to first a women's prison and then eventually to San Quentin. I thought what was particularly, it's interesting, reading your book is like reading the story of the Titanic or the Kennedy assassination or Custer's Last Stand because you know the ending, but the journey there was made so much more interesting by your research. And you said that you received the trial transcript of 4,000 pages. So you probably got nearly blind reading this.
And yet it is what I do for a living. I handle court-appointed appeals, and that's what you do. You get the transcript of these trials, and some of them are 4,000 pages or more. And some of them are not, thank goodness. But so you get used to summarizing and pouring through all of this. And hers was very lengthy, and there was a lot of detail in it. But it was one of these things that you come to the end of it, and I am mindful of Jay Miller Levy's closing argument, and it was a hideous thing that he did, but it really took effect, and I could see it take effect. He she wound up having to take the witness stand and testify, which very seldom do you want your client to do this. You do not want them to have to bear up under cross-examination, though Barbara, to her credit, stood toe to toe with this professional prosecutor and did rather well. But because she was not the meek and, wallflower, fading, fainting Ophelia, which is probably what the jury would have liked better, that may have not endeared her. In today's world, it probably would have endeared her because she's pretty sharp. Nevertheless, she was forced onto the witness stand because of this false alibi effort that they put on. She had to explain she was simply desperate. She didn't know what else to do. She really wasn't at the crime scene, but she admitted she was to him, to the undercover officer, because she needed the alibi. She knew, and her lawyer had told her, and her lawyer totally took the rap for it and said, I forced you into it. I know I did. I pressured you. So she had to take the witness stand. In closing argument, J. Miller Levy stands up there and tells the jury, now, gentlemen of the jury, you men, I want you to watch out. I want you to be very, very careful because she took that witness stand only to turn your heads, only thinking that you would look at such a pretty woman and say, I can't possibly convict her, can't possibly put her to death. She did it on purpose. She did it to seduce you and to turn you away from the evidence. So, gentlemen, be on your guard. And it was disgusting because not only was it not true, but it's such an obvious ploy on his part to, again, undermine her credibility unfairly. She had to take the witness stand. And of course, the defense doesn't have any comeback. They don't get rebuttal. And he did it, knowing that the defense would only have so far to go with it to say, look, she was simply desperate. She had to take the stand. So what? And sure enough, when the jurors were later interviewed by the press, one of the men came out and said, yeah, I wasn't going to buy that act. I knew what she was doing on that witness stand.
Marcia, could a prosecuting attorney do that today?
What he did? No. I think no judge would allow that kind of character assassination that goes just too far. Now, could they say, she hopes you're going to buy her story, she's lying through her teeth? Sure, they can say that. But to say that she was deliberately trying to seduce the men on the jury, I think that might be a bridge too far,
Hmm.
especially given the circumstances.
No, I hear you. So, so she goes to San Quentin, and then she's later executed. The whole process is where the all of these appeals. But by the way, I learned from this whole process. I never knew what an appellate court was and an appellate judge. I now know what that is. It's referring to the appeals, et cetera, et cetera. See, I'm getting an education. And I always tell people that I've always been interested in history and writing. So there is a possibility early on in my life I could have headed in the direction of being an attorney, but I didn't know any attorneys. There were no attorneys in our family. There was nobody like that. When you were growing up, did you have people in the family that led you down that attorney path? Was there somebody guiding you in that way?
No, there was
No.
nobody. There were no lawyers in the family. It's so interesting you mentioned that. And so when I decided to go to law school, everybody was like, really? You sure? It wasn't anything I had been looking at. I wanted to work in the State Department for the Foreign Office, hoping to be out in the field, actually specializing in the Middle East. And they were not interested in girls at all. They asked me if I could type, and I spoke four languages at the time. It's like, dude, it was really funny. I thought maybe things had changed, but then years ago, not that many years ago, a woman came up to me. She'd been in the DA's office. She was super cool. She said, I wanted to work in the State Department too. And I tried to do it many years after you did, and they still were not interested in girls.
Crazy. Now I am going to put up a picture of, let's see if I have it here. Um, yes. Okay. I Want to Live, produced by Walter Wanger, one of the top producers in Hollywood, directed by Robert Wise, who would shortly win an Oscar not only for West Side Story, but for The Sound of Music, one of my favorite directors. In fact, on my podcast last week, I featured a 1980 interview with Robert Wise talking about The Sound of Music on its 60th anniversary. I hadn't seen it in years, as I mentioned earlier, and it has that very jazzy score opening it. What was did you watch the movie before you started writing the book, or did you just know the movie?
I didn't know the movie. I had never heard of Barbara Graham. I knew nothing about it. She was just an accident. I was looking into another case entirely, and then she was a footnote. I looked at that, and when I saw that it had actually been the subject of so much attention, and there was a movie and all the rest of it, I thought, oh, everybody's already written about this, and I actually wasn't going to look any further. I was going to move on, and then I looked to see what has been written about it, and found almost nothing. I mean, newspaper articles, but the more I read of the newspaper articles, the more I saw that they were really tabloid-esque, very sensationalized, certainly not telling you the truth about the case. And the only book that had been written was written in collaboration with the prosecution by a reporter for the Herald Examiner, one of the most sensationalized tabloids going in terms of the coverage of the case. So I realized there is room to tell the truth of it. So I eventually did see the movie at some point in my travels along this case. And it was really fun. I mean, it's very stylized and it's very 50s noir. Susan Hayward is terrific in it. Um, Not much of it is really that accurate, honestly, but and it's very, of course, favorable. Walter Wenger was, as I understand it, a death penalty abolitionist. And he made the movie because he wanted to persuade people to abolish the death penalty. And it almost worked. They did hold hearings after her execution
Well,
about that.
the most tense part of the movie, and I felt the most effective part of the movie, obviously Susan's performance was really wonderful, was the when she goes to San Quentin is waiting out that day. And the way that Robert Wise directs those sequences, it's almost a documentary on how to murder, how to, excuse me, how to execute somebody, and what they were doing in those days. In the whole lead up to walking down that what do they call it, the last mile. Is of course it wasn't the last mile. The gas chamber was literally next door to her cell. And because
Yeah.
she was the only woman in San Quentin, she had this whole area to herself. And it's a devastating sequence of a movie to watch. And I could see that as being one of the major factors as being an anti-death penalty. How long did California wait to abolish the death penalty?
Well, we abolished it and then brought it back. And it still actually is on the books, but there's a moratorium. It's been a moratorium for at least 10 years, long time. We haven't really, I don't know when the last execution was. It's been a very long time. But I will say about the movie, Walter wanted to make sure that that aspect of the movie was absolutely accurate. And that is the one thing both sides agreed on, both pro-prosecution and anti-prosecution, was that the death penalty sequence in that movie was 100% accurate. And so I had all kinds of, because they dug into the investigation on that part of the case so much, I wound up with, he kept an archive, Walter Wenger did, and I got my hands on it, which was wonderful, great source. Gave me Barbara's letters, etc., but it gave me that aspect of it in great detail. And so I got the affidavit of the nurse who spent the night with her, her last night on Earth, which was minute by minute and really heartrending. But I could tell that whole story. And the movie does a good job of telling you exactly how it went.
Right, and like I said, it's a devastating moment, and I just can't say enough about your book. I think it's really a terrific examination, a forensic examination, but never getting too technical. I think a lot of lawyers can bring in a lot of legalese sometimes that goes a little bit beyond. I remember reading Vincent Bugliosi's discussion of the Kennedy assassination, which is about 6 inches thick. And it goes on and on, but your book was straight to the point, and everybody who's listening and watching, I think you'll really enjoy a look at a case that is not well known today, but Marcia's done a terrific job, and you've been really kind of feathering your nest with some great writing. I mean, you have been writing novels.
I have. I wrote two series, one based on Rachel Knight, prosecutor, the second series based on Samantha Brinkman, defense attorney,
Now,
and then a standalone.
are these fictional characters that you've
Yeah,
created? So you
fictional.
created kind of a modern Perry Mason type scenarios of
Except they're lawyers, but yeah, I mean, it's there. well, Perry Mason was a lawyer too. We always wind up, even if it's a lawyer, they wind up acting like a detective because that's the fun part,
Right,
you
of
know.
course, of course.
Yeah.
Now, has there been any Hollywood interest in your novels?
In the novels, yes. The the Rachel Knight series, they shot a pilot, but it didn't go forward. Blood Defense, the Samantha Brinkman sold a pilot script, but it stopped there. But you never know. And, and Barbara would be a great story, a great limited.
Yes. Well, it's interesting because I was looking at the research that is it Lindsay Wagner played her in a TV remake back in the day. Did you know that?
I did know that. I didn't
Yeah.
see it. Did you see
I,
it?
I did not see it. Like a lot of television movies, once they're aired, they seem to disappear.
Yeah,
Television movies don't seem to get a rebirth. Marcia, this has
true.
been terrific. I knew nothing about the case other than seeing the movie, and as we talked about, the movie just presents a certain side of it. It's a very entertaining movie, and certainly we see the cast of characters. I think the casting of Emmett Perkins and Jack Santos they look just like the real people.
They really
And of
did.
course, one of my favorite actors, Simon Oakland, plays the journalist who kind of turns it around at the end. Was that's is that Ed Zimmerman?
That's the real character is Ed Montgomery. It was
Ed
based on
Montgomery.
him.
Ed
And he was
Montgomery.
somebody who had been writing, along with all the rest of the press, really demonizing articles about Barbara. Towards the end, wound up because he was in San Francisco. He came down to watch the trial and realized, you know what? This isn't fitting for me. This isn't working. And he became her biggest champion.
Right, right. And Simon Oakland did a good job in the movie. Well, we have been listening and watching Marcia Clark. The name of the book is Trial by Ambush. Let me put up a real quick slide here. Uh, and it's really a very interesting book. And for even for people who aren't well, everybody seems to be interested in true crime these days. There's so many podcasts devoted to true crime. This is definitely one of the better experiences. You've been listening and watching Saturday Night the Movies. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer's Ben Shrewsbury. We love the fact that you watch and listen to us. Please keep watching and listening. And our other podcast, Tales from Hollywoodland, is also available and find our podcasts everywhere. Marcia, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's been a real pleasure.
Take care.